Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second webinar of the 2020-2021 EPRC seminar program. My name is Wilbert den Hoed. I'm a postdoc researcher at EPRC, and I'll be chairing today's seminar. In normal circumstances, this seminar would have taken place face-to-face at University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. We look forward to doing that again in the future. But at this moment, we're just very happy that you can join us in this online manner from different places, people from Scotland, England, I think, and for me, I wouldn't be able to chair this meeting from our EPRC Delft location in the Netherlands, so I guess there's a good side to all of this. Before introducing our speaker, I just wanted to mention a few quick webinar rules. Most of them you probably know by now. It won't be your first webinar this year. I would like to inform you that the meeting is being recorded, which means that you or your colleagues will have the opportunity to recap the meeting at a later stage. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel and also shared with you by email. We would also like to encourage you to use Twitter to share your thoughts on the webinar, and please use hashtag EPRC webinar if you're doing so. The order of things, our speaker Lewis Evans will do a presentation of around 20 to 30 minutes, after which we'll have time for Q&A with you, and we will finish around about 1 p.m. UK time. It's just a reminder to keep your microphone on mute if you're not speaking, and during the Q&A, please use the blue hand which you'll find in the Zoom options in the bottom of your screen. If you want to make an intervention, if you have a question, and also feel free to use the chat function to send your comments also during the presentation, and then we'll pick them up afterwards. So let me now present today's speaker, Dr. Lewis Evans. As he's at the moment a strategic program officer at Tees Valley Combined Authority, but I've heard that he will soon move to a different job at Northumberland Council at the Rural Development and Energy Policy Department, I believe. He is relatively freshly graduated from his PhD at Newcastle University, where Lewis and I coincided, I think since about 2015-16, at the Geography Department. And Lewis worked there as a researcher in CURDS, which may be familiar to you, the Center for Urban and Regional Development Studies. Today, Lewis presents his PhD research. So I heard something from him when it was maybe in the first years of his PhD, and that's why I'm very keen also to hear what's been made of that. He'll present his PhD research that he worked on for these years. Today's presentation is titled Adaptation, Governance and Industrial Diversification, North Sea Ports and the Growth of Offshore Wind. And it's very relevant in the field of evolutionary economic geography. It's also very much related to some of the work we do here at EPRC. For instance, in a project we're working on in the context of an quite large Horizon 2020 project about renewable energy transitions in coal-intensive regions. I can share the link with you. Please check it after Lewis finishes his presentation. From my side, there's nothing else to say. So over to you, Lewis. You can share your slides, please, and give it a start.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can everyone see that one? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Good stuff. So yeah, thank you for that introduction. So yeah, I'm the Strategic Program Officer at Tees Valley Combined Authority. I've been there since late last year. I'm a former PhD student at Newcastle University in the Department for Geography and the Centre for Urban and Regional Development Studies. So I finished my PhD this year in the spring, and I defended it successfully, and corrections were made in the summer. So everything's tied up, and I'm just trying to disseminate this the best I can to make people understand what it was all about and its relevance to academic circles, policy arenas, and government. Because in my opinion, I think it's extremely relevant due to our turn towards clean growth and our turn towards energy transition, both nationally and subnationally. So I think there's some important lessons that a range of bodies can learn from this work. I've got to note that the title has changed multiple times. So the finished title was Adaptation, Governance, Industrial Diversification, North Sea Ports, and the Growth of Offshore Wind. And today I really want to discuss the cases themselves, which I used because they're probably most relevant and it could probably chime most of your understanding of how ports change, and I think they'll probably resonate with you a little bit more strongly than me delving into academic theory too strongly. So I'll crack on. So in terms of the context, I want to set out some context first. The project builds upon my MA dissertation pilot, which looked at the adaptation and evolution of the Port of Tyne, which kind of explored how the Port of Tyne evolved and continued to be an important economic actor in the northeast. Originally, it was dependent upon some key markets in terms of imports and exports of raw materials. It went into container handling, and then it moved into supporting renewable energy, including biomass and automotive through the Nissan factory in Sunderland. So you can see then I really did understand how ports can adapt and change over time and support new economic growth and new markets. And one of the key lessons I think what came out of that project was ports can be a dynamic driver for economic growth in a region and a platform essentially for wider economic growth and a supporter of other sectors in terms of their growth as well. It was a 3-year ESRC collaborative studentship with the Humber Local Enterprise Partnership in the Humber region. And they were very, very supportive in terms of supporting my field work and opening doors to interview both national government, subnational government, and firms and academic partners as well. So that was a really strong studentship, I think, and that partner relationship was really strong. My supervisors were Professor Danny McKinnon, who's the director of CURDS at Newcastle, and Stuart Dawley, who's the current head of geography at Newcastle University as well. So I just wanted to kind of firstly outline the agenda for the PhD and the key research gaps that I identified. In terms of its wider contribution, it contributes to the fields of evolutionary economic geography and more broadly then port studies. And what I quickly realized that these concepts of adaptation, of change over time, of institutions, of ports, of regions can be applied to ports as economic actors. And the concept of diversifying markets, diversification of industries within regions can also be applied at a smaller spatial scale to a port as a key economic actor. And this was drawn from fields of evolutionary economic geography, so people like Ron Martin at Cambridge and Andy Pike at Newcastle and Peter Sunley at Southampton. This is the kind of academic literature and thought that I drew upon. And one of the key research gaps, what I've previously mentioned, is ports are strategic asset bases, the hard infrastructural bases that can be adapted and changed and diversified to support new economic growth. And it's often the case that ports are overlooked in shaping regional growth and regional path creation, i.e. the creation of new sectors and industries within regions. They're a peculiar kind of body because they're both physical and they're both kind of intangible at the same time. And they're different to firms. They've got this rootedness within places. You can't lift up a port and put it somewhere else. They've got distinctive governance structures across national contexts. They're more privately owned in the UK, more publicly owned in countries like Germany, the Netherlands, and France, etc. And as I said before, the physical assets that can be adapted and changed to support different sectors and their growth as sectors emerge and diverge and change within regions. So they're completely different to firms as economic actors to explore. And as I said before, it's a contribution to port studies more broadly. And offshore wind provides a new example, I think, of port diversification. Ports in the past have changed to support and handle containers, different fuels, different raw materials, cruise passenger terminals, all these sorts of things. But offshore wind is a new industry. It came about when ports were thinking of new opportunities as well. So yeah, offshore wind provides a new example to explore how ports change and adapt over time and diversify into new markets and diversify their infrastructure to support new sectors. So as I've said, why are ports interesting? They're an infrastructural platform for other sectors to grow. They act as an enabler, they act as a catalyzer essentially for new regional paths, i.e. without ports, the offshore wind industry in certain regions of the UK or elsewhere wouldn't have been able to function or take off, and their economic benefits what offshore wind can provide wouldn't have happened without the port infrastructure changing and adapting. And I think there's a key interrelation to regional economic policy and strategy, both in the UK and beyond. They're a key kind of infrastructural asset and body that needs to be integrated within economic policy and have a stronger focus, in my opinion. So what were the key areas of interest within the thesis? I think the overall aim of the thesis was to better understand and assess the processes of port adaptation and diversification, i.e. understanding how these processes unfolded over time, understanding the drivers of them, the factors that underpin them processes and what shaped them. So my first question that I want to kind of address was what forms of port diversification had been developed by port authorities or local institutions, i.e. local authorities, local enterprise partnerships, combined authorities, subnational governments, both in the UK and Germany. And these forms of port diversification differed between the cases, which we'll explore later. I also wanted to kind of uncover in what ways port ownership and governance models shaped the port's capacity to adapt, private versus public. You have other examples of trust ports in the UK, which I didn't go into, but it could be a future area of exploration. And lastly, how do multi-scalar institutional environments enable or constrain port adaptation? So what I mean by that is, how do the national government, subnational, regional and local governments interact? What are the policies created by national government and subnational government? How do they shape and constrain port adaptation? How do these different levels of government work with each other? And what are the wider economic support and financial support given to ports and offshore wind industry? How do their mechanisms and interventions shape how port adaptation changes? So in terms of I'm jumping ahead in terms of the thesis here, but I think it's a good place to put it here. This is the kind of framework that I came up with for looking at port adaptation and diversification. And this can be applied not only to offshore wind, but ports diversifying into other sectors such as automotive or other sectors. So I'll just run through this quickly. Firstly, I think ports need to look at their asset base, their infrastructure and material asset. What are the kind of firm activities, the industrial assets on there? What are the natural assets in terms of the river depth, the physical constraints? What's the institutional workings of the port? And who are the people running the port, essentially? Who are the key individuals actually making the decisions and shaping how a port changes and adapts over time? And these assets can be shaped essentially by the port authority, subnational government agencies and private firms. And at the same time, these actors are shaped by wider national, subnational and local layers of institutions and the interventions that they propose, and the support and financial support that they give out for offshore wind and for other markets. And the wider market environment essentially can shape how actors make decisions and how they actually change the assets. And actors change these assets through, I think, two kind of modes of investment, through conversion, i.e. the changing of brownfield land on ports, and expansion through the expansion of infrastructure on greenfield land. And you can see within the, I'll show you later on, but you can see through the 2 different port case studies how these 2 different modes of investment differed and how they played out differently. And as a result of changing and adapting the port and diversifying, it can support wider regional path creation, which is the final box on the right hand side. And the blue arrow along the bottom kind of represents the overall process of port adaptation and diversification over time. And it's really an ongoing process. There's no start and finish to this framework, but it's an ongoing process of change, I think. So to give you a bit of a broader context for those not familiar with the regions I'm going to be talking about, the empirical cases are located in the Humber region in East Yorkshire, and Cuxhaven, which is on the northern coast of Germany, on the mouth of the River Elbe. So that just gives you a bit of a context of where these cases are in the wider North Sea geography. So in terms of Cuxhaven, then, as I said, it's at the mouth of the River Elbe. It sits in the state of Niedersachsen, which is Lower Saxony. It's in some ways quite a post-industrial region, a region that has typically higher unemployment rates than other parts of Germany, and it's a similar region really to the Humber region in the UK in my sense of things. It's also got a neighbouring state government of Bremerhaven, which sits just to the south, and it's got a rival port there of Bremerhaven, which comes into play within the case studies and the PhD as well. This is the Humber region. I based this on the local enterprise partnership boundary, which you can see, which is the black line all the way around the outside, with local authorities sitting within that. And this is the region, which is again post-industrial. It's typically region with higher unemployment than other parts of the UK and north of England. So that gives you a bit of context there. So in terms of the first case, and the UK case was the Humber Port, and I explored this between 2017 and 18. And the reasons I put the dates on there is because these cases are continually changing and adapting, and there's new firms getting involved, there's new firms coming out of the cases and the ports over time. So I just wanted to give you that context of it is a snapshot of time between 17 and 18 when I did these interviews. So it's currently a port. The port case currently undertakes manufacturing, installation, and operations and maintenance activities. There's 3 kind of main active firms. So Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy, which manufactures blades at the Port of Hull. You've got Ørsted, which is previously named Dong Energy, which has a huge operations and maintenance base at the Port of Grimsby in the Royal Dock, which you can see on the bottom picture here. In this building here, and this is the Siemens plant here, which is on the Alexandra dock. Governance, it's privately owned and managed by Associated British Ports, which is the largest port owner in the UK, which is a public limited company. And historically, there has been some tensions and issues. So there's been this North Bank, South Bank rivalry on the Humber Estuary in terms of the different ports on the Humber Estuary and the local councils as well. And historically speaking, ABP were reluctant to collaborate closely with local councils and subnational government agencies, whether that's regional development agencies or local enterprise partnerships in the past. But the case really uncovered how ABP did change their way of working and change their way of thinking and work more closely with these bodies. So in terms of the adaptation of the port, of the Humber ports and the creation of a new regional path, the PhD is organized through kind of episodes of change. I try to classify these case studies in episodes of change. So in the early stages, the ports were still working with firms to attract their inward investment. There was low levels of operations and maintenance activities. The big investments hadn't came yet. So in that path origins development phase, the direct employment at the ports in terms of offshore wind was very low. In between 2011 and 13, we've seen this period of disruption and uncertainty as Siemens' investment into the Port of Hull became constrained by government indecision in terms of their ability to set out future offshore wind capacity targets. There was kind of tension between the joint venture between Associated British Ports and Siemens Gamesa to get the blade factory up and running. But at the same time, over on the other side of the river at the port of Grimsby, you had the operations and maintenance activities actually growing and doing very well, with Dong Energy making some sizable investments there. And then later on in 2013, Siemens made their commitment and began to adapt the port of Hull and began to construct the blade manufacturing site, and eventually it created 1,000 direct jobs there, and it provided a real new lease of life for the city of Hull. And at the same time, in partnership with that development on the north bank of the port of Hull, we had a range of O&M operations and maintenance operators coming in and investing into the port of Grimsby as well. So you're seeing this path change and this exponential change of employment and economic growth and wider benefits for the Humber region. The port of Cuxhaven is a little bit different. And as I said, I undertook this research in 2018. And what you'll probably see straight away is this is one port, whereas the previous case study was 2 ports. And the reason I kind of picked this one is because it had the same infrastructural scale as a port of Hull and Grimsby, which was supporting offshore wind. It had the 3 kind of key offshore wind activities of O&M, installation and manufacturing as well. So it offered a really strong comparator, especially when Siemens was manufacturing nacelles, which is the bit of equipment that goes on, the part that goes on top of the wind turbine. And it had suppliers as well moving into that port. There was also Amber, which manufactures foundations as well. And it had smaller contract-based installation O&M firms. And it's also got Siemens wider manufacturing firms moving into the port as well. It's completely different in terms of ownership and governance to the port of the Humber Port. So it's publicly owned by the state of Lower Saxony. It's operated by a publicly owned company, but it also has a private operator which operates the multi-purpose terminal, which is not to do with offshore wind. So it's a completely different arrangement to the port of Hull Grimsby. It's a key site for offshore wind, I think, in Germany. It's a leader, and this was kind of driven by the offshore base Cuxhaven master plan, which is set out way back in 2003. And that kind of demonstrates how the state of Lower Saxony and Cuxhaven were really ahead of the game in terms of projecting the future and thinking about horizon thinking in terms of we're going to get into offshore wind, we're going to make a future plan for it, we're going to build out the infrastructure and be the winners in this industry. And as a result, became the leading offshore wind port in northern Germany, supporting a range of North Sea offshore wind projects since the mid-2000s. But as I've said, there's been tensions and competition from Port of Bremerhaven, and there was tensions and competition for land and the Siemens investment and other previous investments as well in the neighbouring state of Bremen. And that really did come through strongly in the case study. So as I've said before, I tried to organise this into episodes and causal episodes of change. So again, similarly, we had that emergence and growth period in 2006, 2012. But the key difference to the Humber ports was there was large-scale investment going into infrastructure at a much more rapid pace. There was 3 or 4 firms coming in, manufacturing firms. They've since pulled out, but they were still investing at that time. In that second period, we had a stronger period of uncertainty and disinvestment, and had a stronger impact on employment and regional economic growth, I think, because I had 2 or 3 firms come out of the port of Cuxhaven. But at the same time, we had that stronger regional revival and expansion in 2014 when Siemens decided to invest in the port of Cuxhaven, and its other suppliers became co-located there as well. So it's seen a huge boost in employment and growth of the port of Cuxhaven, really, in offshore wind. And it's become a leading base there. So it kind of fended off the competition, I would say, of other regional ports. So just to explain these episodes in a bit more detail, I think is really important. So in the Humber Ports case, we're seen from 2006 really to 2011, both the Port of Hull and Grimsby trying to capture manufacturing investment. It eventually did happen in the Port of Hull, and the Port of Grimsby diversified its fish stock to get into supporting operations and maintenance activities. We've seen that longer term continued O&M investment in the Port of Grimsby, but at the same time we've seen that disruption of manufacturing investment and that uncertainty around the Siemens inward investment at the Port of Hull, and it really did cause some concern. And it took a lot of lobbying from the Humber in terms of the LEP and the local the local councils and even MPs and national government officials to really make it the point clear to the government that this needs to be supported. In 2013 onwards, as I've said, you got these flagship manufacturing investments, and that's really when we're seeing that step change in the case study, and we're seeing the port adapt and the infrastructure change to support offshore wind, and that coincided with that ongoing expansion of O&M, and that was essentially because Dong Energy, Ørsted, wanted to develop and expand and support the development of their offshore wind projects in the North Sea, and it's the UK's leading base now for O&M. So when you look at it, it's completely different. When you look at the Port of Cuxhaven case, it's more proactive and it's more visionary, I would say. We had this new vision come about in 2003 of we're going to build out the offshore wind base. This was the land plan we had. We had key infrastructure planned out. These are where the keys are going to be. This is the investment we're predicting to be making. Then they moved into this really clever idea of a demonstration effect. So they set up some pilot turbines on the site to kind of demonstrate the potential of offshore wind, because at this point in time, this was a really young industry. It was kind of embryonic in a sense of things. People didn't really know what it was and what the potential of it was. And that kind of brought about the state government to influence a governance change. So essentially a new port company was created, and that governed and managed the port, and new individuals were brought in with new ideas to really push forward offshore wind at the Port of Cuxhaven, and it was separated out from the state government, which was a really step change, because I don't think they had the right individuals in the state government at the time to really drive this project forward, and that's the opinion I got from my interviewees. And this new body that came in, Meter Saxon Ports, really took a strong hold of the port and put in the long-term policies and actually implemented this. So in and around that time, the state government really did become really strongly involved in changing the port, and they committed sizable amount of capital to invest in infrastructure to provide that hard physical infrastructure base to actually attract the offshore wind manufacturers. And that actually did happen. We've seen Bard and Cuxhaven Steel Construction came through the door early. They ran into some financial difficulties and they ended up going bankrupt, which was a really interesting case. But that's often the case with new industries like this. You have early players that enter the market too soon and don't really understand the marketplace. But at the same time, that didn't really faze the officials at the Port of Cuxhaven. They knew that offshore wind was going to be the new market, so they continued to press ahead with establishing the new infrastructure, and that attracted eventually Siemens later on down the line. It attracted Strabag, which was potentially going to make foundations, and it attracted Ambau, which also made foundations. So you can see how this huge amount of capital investment and this long-term plan really did attract future players, and it didn't really dissuade the port actors from changing the strategy despite this investment, which led eventually, as I've said, to the new rounds of investment from 2014 onwards. And to this day, the Port of Cuxhaven is still building out infrastructure for future market growth. So I just want to kind of give you a physical impression of it, really, of how the infrastructure changed. So where I've got the cursor here, this is where the Siemens offshore wind terminal was built, and this Alexandra dock was extended. This originally was a full dock that was filled in, so it was a huge amount of infrastructure work and investment, and essentially it was enabled by I think it was a £320 million joint venture between Siemens and ABP to do this. And you can see how, in the wider sense of things, it's a relatively important part of the Port of Hull in terms of its wider market portfolio, which concentrates on containers as well, and concentrates on the P&O terminal as well, and other markets. So yeah, that gives you a good kind of visual representation of the port and how it changed. This is where it was all built out, and there was huge kind of benefits for offshore wind manufacturers coming in here, and the stores coming in here because of the depth of the river, the natural assets, as I was talking about earlier. The quay was ready to be built out, and there was an awful lot of land to get the factory built, and a lot of room for assembling the turbines as well on the shore. The Port of Grimsby was a lot different. It's a smaller port, and this is where the operations and maintenance occurs. So Orsted have their base in the Royal Dock, which is where my cursor is now. But earlier, back in 2007, the smaller operations and maintenance companies came into the fish dock because it was ready to be set up because of the previous fishing fleet that was there, and the infrastructure was ready to go. And the operations and maintenance and the project developers saw that was a great opportunity. So yeah, again, this gives you a flavour of what it looks like, and the O&M operators are in here. This is Ostense Base with the big vessels coming in, and all of this land essentially was derelict. It had timber and raw materials on it before, which was cleared, and both Orsted and ABP saw a new opportunity in this. And the fish dock, again, is a similar story. It was disused docks, disused pontoons, which were reused and adapted and installed, which eventually enabled these firms to come in. As I've said before, the Port of Cuxhaven is a completely different beast. The scale is a lot larger in terms of its physical scale and its ambition, in my opinion. So you can see here how over time you can see the infrastructure being built out to capture new investment from berth 1 to berth 9. Some of this is in planning stage, and some of it has actually went beyond this because this is quite an old. This diagram's a couple of years old, so you can see how this infrastructure has changed, and they're really proactive about it as well. So yeah, this gives you again a kind of visual idea of what it looks like. This is the Siemens factory here, and all of this land here is being developed essentially for offshore wind. Again, this is quite an old photograph, but the quays will be developed out here as well, which are in planning stage. So you can see how the use of land and Greenfield land in Cuxhaven has enabled the rapid expansion of the port, which differs really from the Humber ports, which depended largely upon Brownfield land, and that constrained the development in terms of planning, risk of investment to stakeholders as well. So in terms of the key findings, in terms of the Humber Port's case, the national institutional context was vital. It shaped the market environment for the firms and the privately owned port authorities to take the risks, but at the same time, it provided periods of certainty and uncertainty. As offshore wind targets changed, as financial mechanisms for offshore wind changed, it disrupted the inward investment patterns. In terms of strategy and vision, it was a more reactive investment strategy from ABP. It reacted to the offshore wind market coming about, and then it said, oh, yes, we'll have a bit of that. We'll put some money into the infrastructure to capture that. They'd only decided to go into it when they were approached by the firms and had seen it as a new market opportunity. It was, again, as I've said, it was more reactive port governance. And it was enabled by key individuals, I think, maybe 4 or 5 key individuals at the top of ABP and the Humber who thought strategically and really grasped the opportunity to provide port infrastructure to capture these offshore wind activities. And these investments made by ABP were made in a different way that had done in the past, but at the same time they had to be made to satisfy shareholder demand, and that's why the disruption occurred between 2011 and 2013. So that's a key difference, I think, and it constrained the period's investment. In terms of the Port of Cuxhaven, similarly, again, it shaped the market environment for firms. It enabled it to take place due to the subsidies given to the offshore wind industry. It enabled the ports, the offshore wind firms, to commit to investment. But again, it had periods of certainty and uncertainty. The targets for offshore wind were changed. That disrupted the confidence and the ability for firms to make commitments, offshore wind firms to make commitments into the port as well. The strategy and vision was different. As I said, it was long term. It was visionary. It was launched way back in 2003 when the offshore wind market was really in its infancy in Germany and in Europe. But it was a vision that set out where the infrastructure was going to go, the potential investment that was required, and it really did drive forward the confidence of inward investment. It was a different kind of governance and investment approach. It was more proactive. That change of governance really did drive it forward, and provided a new strategy. And the Port Authority, the state government, and the local government made proactive investments into the port infrastructure to attract the firms, as opposed to in the Humber was seen more reactive investments. So that is essentially shaped by their governance and their ownership. The Humber ports are privately owned, dependent upon making returns on investment, whereas publicly owned port actors in Germany were willing to take that risk and willing to make that investment for the public good and to actually create some large-scale manufacturing space and a new path for Cuxhaven, which was, as I said, was a region that was reasonably poor and still is to some degrees. So what were the key factors that were actually underpinning the port adaptation diversification process throughout the PhD? What did it actually uncover? So it was the importance of national market creation. The creation of the offshore wind market was vital for these ports to adapt. So it initially enabled that enthusiasm and that investment, but it subsequently constrained the investment due to the changes in terms of installed capacity targets, in terms of the mechanisms that were supporting the market, the financial mechanisms that were supporting the market as well. So that was a key factor. The role of strategy and vision. So you had that more opportunistic, short-term investments in the Humber ports, but then you had more strategic and long-term planning in Cuxhaven. So you've seen that that's a key factor, I think, in any process of port adaptation and change. Another key one was the pre-existing asset base, the key physical assets, the land, the quayside land, and the infrastructure shaped the capacity for these ports to adapt and change. You had underutilized port site in the Humber ports, which had brownfield land. It caused difficulties in changing it in terms of planning, but it was very costly to change as well. But at the same time, it was viewed as an asset that could actually capture new investment, versus the port site in Cuxhaven, which had that potential to expand on greenfield land. Again, it brought new challenges and different challenges to the Humber. So they both enable and constrain port adaptation in their own individual ways, I think. The port governance settings, as I've said, really does influence the investment approaches. So you get more reactive investment decisions and strategies due to private ownership, because the port authorities need to satisfy shareholder demand. Whereas you've got more proactive planning and investment due to public ownership. You can take that long-term view. There's no shareholders to answer to. And so you've got these really strong, distinctive ownership models and governance settings that shape port adaptation and change. And then lastly, it was the role of firm investment, essentially, and the corporate strategies which catalyzed port diversification. You had these contrasting instances and levels of dependence upon firm investment. So, i.e. in the Humber Port's case, you had that larger dependence of the port authorities in terms of the offshore wind firms actually making a commitment. And then the port authorities said, oh yes, we'll match that commitment, we'll support that market. Whereas in the Port of Cuxhaven, the authorities thought themselves, we need to create a new economic path for Cuxhaven. We need to create new economic growth here. We're going to make there's sizable investment in the Port of Cuxhaven in terms of infrastructure to create new manufacturing land and to create a new growth path without any commitments from external firms. And I remember interviewing somebody who was really close to the project and close to the port, and I asked him, well, what happens if the offshore wind market didn't come about? What happens if that opportunity didn't arise? And he gave a quite a simple answer, really. It was about creating the land for any opportunity that was going to come about. They had offshore wind market in the front of their minds, but they also understood the risk of that, and they also understood that the land and the port infrastructure could be adapted for something else. So these are the kind of key factors I think that really underpin the port change and diversification. And I think going forward, these are the things that, as I've said, the port authorities need to consider, both in the UK and beyond, and local authorities to consider as well. That's everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lewis. That was fascinating to hear. I'm sure people have some questions or need to want to hear some clarifications from you. I think it was, yeah, very relevant in terms of the context in that we are in now, when countries, regions are looking for clean growth initiatives, when in the UK and elsewhere there are different decarbonization strategies. And it's very nice also that you provided this sort of practical, well, combined this academic and practical policy angle. So thank you very much for that. I haven't seen any direct questions in the chat, so if anyone has a question, feel free to unmute and ask it in the chat. Sorry, ask it on the screen. I think we have a question here by David. Yeah, feel free to ask it.
Yes, on the basis of your study, are you able to say which of the two approaches has produced the more investment and growth in this case? That's to say, the public proactive approach or the private reactive approach. Is there enough evidence to say which has been better at producing investment and growth?
Thank you, David. I would say the German model is slightly stronger, I would say. I think because it's created that long-term infrastructure that can be used for an awful long amount of time, and it can attract inward investment for a long period of time. And with the Port of Hull and Grimsby, it's only adapted the infrastructure and the land to satisfy a couple of inward investment projects. So I think in terms of investment appetite, I think that the Port of Cuxhaven's created that more long-term offer, because they're still planning out the infrastructure, they're still building it out, and I think it's a more long-term approach that they've taken. But that's not to say that the story in the Humber was not successful. It definitely was, and it created an awful lot of opportunity out of some derelict brownfield land. So yeah, I think I would probably say the German model edges it slightly, but if you're looking at raw employment numbers, there's not much difference. But if you look at the terms of types of employment, the types of employment in the Port of Cuxhaven, it's more high skilled. There's highly skilled engineers working there, whereas in the Port of Hull, it's more assembly based activities. And in the Port of Grimsby, which is in the Humber Port's case, you've got some operations and maintenance technicians, which is quite a highly skilled job, and some really high quality opportunities there. But in terms of the general scale of things, I would say Germany, that the Port of Cuxhaven has, and it's got more high skilled employment and high level employment there. But yeah, as you've said, as you kind of alluded to there, it is hard to make a distinction between the two in terms of actual success, because it drags into the question of what is success in terms of this. So yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David and Louis. I think we have another question. We have a hand raised by Louis M. Can you please unmute and ask your question?
Yes, it's Mark Lewis, Tees Valley Combined Authority, work with Lewis. Just a question about the commercial structures on the two ports. Presumably the ports lease the land to the operators on the port, do they? And over what sort of period do they have leases for, if you know? Yeah.
Well, yes, the owners do lease the land to the operators. In terms of the actual length of contracts, I'm not quite sure. I know that the O&M activities, as you probably know already, the turbines have a lifetime of about 25 years. So I suspect that the leases for the O&M operators are going to be a lot longer. I think the port operators, especially ABP in the UK's case, they were probably a bit more reluctant to offer a longer term lease to manufacturers, because the manufacturing market for offshore wind is going to change as the turbines get bigger, and Siemens typically got a tendency of pulling out certain markets as well in certain regions. So I don't know for definite what the lease terms were. No.
Good, thank you, Louis and Louis. Anyone else who would like to ask a question? We still have some time. Rona, I see your hand up.
Hi, yes. Hi, yes. I'd just be interested to, first of all, thanks for a really interesting talk. I'd be interested to hear your views on how useful a sort of a national or regional strategic framework for port development is. I'm thinking because in Scotland we have the sort of National Renewables Infrastructure Plan, and just wondered what your views were on that.
I think it's extremely important. As I've seen in Germany, it's got a stronger industrial policy for ports, especially at the state level. So I'll give you a bit of an example for that. In Lower Saxony back in the early 2000s, they actually decided what activities were going to go where at each port. And there's a neighbouring port called the Port of Wilhelmshaven. And essentially, they decided that a deep water port was going to go there. And they thought to themselves, well, what about Cuxhaven? What can we offer Cuxhaven? And they offered the offshore wind base. This is what we're going to prioritise here. So that's some real strong, active policy decisions. And we have port policy in this country, in the UK. It's very loose. Not many people know about it. So I think it is important, but I think doing it in the right way is even more important, in terms of actively making some standpoints and some statements. This is the activities we want here, and not always letting the market decide where things go, because sometimes it doesn't happen at all. We've seen that from ABP in the Humber Port's case. They actively decided to go in offshore wind and actively committed to it. After Siemens came about. That was nothing to do with national government policy or anything like that. It was an actor locally making a decision and actually going for it. The national government provided the framework for offshore wind in the subsidy environment. That's fair enough, and they did that very well. But regional and local decision making actually made that happen. It's the same what's happening in Tees Valley as well. Making an active decision to change portside land and adapt it out to capture newer market opportunities. So I think having a ports framework is important, but as I've said, making some really solid plans is really even more important, and actually meeting them and actually meeting these targets. So yeah, I hope that's answered your question.
Thank you. And I think David asked another question in the chat. Feel free to ask it in person, David.
Yes, the question of Brownfield versus Greenfield. Obviously, British planning policy has had a strong bias towards brownfield, and it has a lot of advantages, for instance, in terms of accessible opportunities in terms of travel to work. But do you think that in practice there are relevant greenfield development opportunities on the Humber which could have been exploited for this type of industry instead of the brownfield, and could still be?
That's a really, really interesting point, actually. I think with the Port of Hull and the Port of Grimsby, as it was brownfield, the advantages of it was it could be more quickly adapted and changed, and could be changed to offshore wind purposes. Versus there's a site planned on the south bank of the Humber, which is Able Marine Energy Park, which is a greenfield site which is totally undeveloped, and it would take a long time for that to develop out. And I do think it's a really good idea to. I think capturing as many offshore wind opportunities as you can on greenfield land is an appropriate move. But in this context, in this story, it was the right way to do it at the Port of Hull and Grimsby, because the developers and the manufacturers needed the land as soon as possible. Siemens actually gave the Port of Hull a window of, this is when we want the land built out. This is what we can capture. This is the demand from the developers who are actually developing an offshore wind park. We need the blades made in this time, so can we have the land as soon as possible? So that brownfield land decision on the Humber made a lot more sense. Whereas you look at as I said, in Cuxhaven, there was no demand there, real demand. They built out the greenfield land to actually capture a future market that they didn't know was going to actually form. So it was a really risky move, but they could do that because of their government arrangement and their ownership. So it is a good question, and it's a difficult one, but in this case, it worked better on brownfield because of the time frame, the time scales that were required, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again. I think I see another hand raised by Anne Wilson, from your colleague from Tees Valley Authority.
Hi, Lewis. Thanks for that. That was really interesting. There's a lot of competition between UK ports all along the east coast, right down sort of the Norfolk, Suffolk coast, right up Scotland. And do you have that same level of competition amongst the German ports? And is that a disadvantage for us in capturing this sort of activity, the fact that there is so much competition?
That's a good question. I think there is the same amount of competition, but there's a smaller amount of leading ports. So I think there's two ports that dominate German port market, which is Bremerhaven and Hamburg, the two leading ports. And as part of the story of Cuxhaven's development, it was kind of pushed towards development and changing because of the dominance of Hamburg down the river, in the River Elbe. It was losing a lot of trade in terms of automotive and cargo and containers. It was all going to Hamburg. So the state of Lower Saxony thought themselves, we need to change our game here. We need to capture some new markets. So as I said, they prioritise offshore wind at Cuxhaven, and they prioritise the deep water terminal at Wilhelmshaven. So I think it is kind of a disadvantage. But it's a hard question to answer, because in the UK, the port authorities react to new market opportunities. They would only change something, or change some infrastructure, or change anything at the port if they're going to realise a new opportunity. If there's a firm interested, and this is what's going to happen. But yeah, I think it's very difficult to encourage it in this country, because there's that lack of that regional state government is really important for making active decisions, and that catalyses the competition essentially in Germany. And you haven't really got that in this country. But yeah, that lack of competition is important for driving future growth at ports and future regional economic growth. You're seeing that at the minute with the Port of Blythe and Northumberland, and you're seeing that in Tees Valley. You can see that in the Humber. They're all trying to clamber on the bandwagon offshore wind, and it is driving competition, and it is driving new activity. But But the missing element is essentially which port is going to get what in the offshore wind game. Which port is going to have the leader manufacturing role, the installation role, the O&M role? Where's it going to go? And obviously for reasons of beyond all of our control, that there's no decision going to be made like that in this country, just because the way the government structure is. So it is really up to the market and where they decide. And on that point, the Humber was chosen essentially because of its wide estuary, its deep estuary, the amount of land that was available to develop. It was very close in terms of sailing time to the offshore wind projects. That was a key factor. Distance is key because it's money at the end of the day to move the vessels in and out. So yeah, it's a lot more complicated in this country. It comes down to geography, it comes down to location, and then it comes down to market appetite essentially for that port, rather than the stronger role of government. Yeah.
Okay, thank you both. That was very clear, Lewis. We're coming up to 1 p.m. So I think we have to round off the session here. I would like to thank all the audience for attending and for participating in the discussion, and of course mainly to Lewis for presenting his very interesting PhD research. And yeah, best of luck in future dissemination of your work, and of course also in your job. I think as part of this webinar series, maybe Liliana will have some announcement to make for other coming webinars.
Yes. So the next webinar that we have planned in the series is November 4th, and it will be Professor Rune Fitjar from the University of Stavanger presenting on the regional impact of COVID-19. So we look forward to having you also attend and contact us if you would want to be in the mailing list or you'd want to attend. Yes. Thank you very much. And thank you, Lewis.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all. That was it for now, and I hope to see you next time then.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Lewis.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye.